And it is time. Hello! Welcome to another episode of Torn Book Club on, what is this? December 20th, 2015. I am your host, Sarumann, aka Josh. And we have a nice fun episode today talking about movies and TV shows that have been adapted into books or expanded, their universe is expanded in book form, which is really just about anything in pop culture at this time. But of course, the big one is the movie that dominated everything this weekend, Star Wars. And we're going to get into a little bit of a discussion about Star Wars, but I'm going to tell you up front now, we're going to keep the spoilers out of this. We're only going to be talking about the plot insofar as stuff that has been revealed in the official movie's publicity. We're not going to get into various character reveals, character arcs, or various surprises that happen in the movie itself, because everybody deserves to enjoy the movie for the first time as clean as possible. So I see we got a lot of folks in the chat already. Ava, Eravani, Esme, I Stole the One Ring, and Jan is back after quite some time away, and it's good to see you, Jan. Welcome back. So just a quick recap before we get into it. Our book of the month for December is A Christmas Story by Gene Shepard, or In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash, both by Gene Shepard. A Christmas Story is a collection of the 5 short stories that the famous holiday classic movie is based on, and In God We Trust is a larger collection of short stories that sort of gives a wider view of the world in which this story takes place. It's up to you as to which you wish to read. We'll be talking mostly about the 5 short stories that A Christmas Story itself is based on. So, without further ado, let's just hop right into it and talk Star Wars. I realize that this is theonering.net. We tend to focus on things Tolkien, but at this point, in this weekend in particular, it's impossible to do anything on the internet without talking about Star Wars right now, and that's okay. I talked about it a little bit with Cliff last week on Torn Tuesday. I hope some of you were able to watch that. And at that point, neither of us had seen the movie yet. I've now seen it. And I'm pretty sure Cliff has seen it at this point too. So how do we talk about Star Wars: The Force Awakens? First of all, just to get it right out there in the open, I like this movie. I really enjoyed it. Did I think it was the greatest Star Wars movie ever made? No. Do I think it's better than the prequels? Absolutely. Do I think it's better than the original trilogy? It's up there. It's up there. It's got a lot of stuff I like. It's got a lot of stuff I didn't like. But the main thing is the new characters I really enjoyed, and I want to see where they go. And so, as far as that goes, I consider this movie to be a success, because this movie, more than anything, what it had to do was it had to sell audiences on these new characters who are going to be the main crux of this new trilogy, and probably further on down the line. So they had to sell us on these characters, and I feel like they did a really good job. I really enjoyed them. I want to see where they're going. I'm invested in them. And it was nice to see some of the older actors come back and reprise their old roles from the original trilogy. Particularly Han Solo, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher as Leia. Both of whom really sort of fit back into those roles like an old glove. Like, it felt like it really felt like I was not watching Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford. I was watching Leia and Han again. And that was really cool. And Ava is saying the best thing was that I was 100% more excited about the new characters than the old. I agree. I was very excited about these new characters. I wanted to see where they were going. I was invested in their conflicts and in their adventure and in everything that they had to go through. Excuse me. There were maybe a few things that I thought were just kind of needless padding, but I don't want to talk about that because we'll get into spoiler territory. But it's mostly in like the midsection of the movie. I thought the beginning was very strong, with the introduction of Rey, Finn, Poe, and BB-8. I was immediately on board with all four of them. We get into the middle section and like we learn more about the characters. They go through some adventures, most of which ultimately amounts to nothing and is really just there to sort of like give them another action beat. One scene in particular, which I felt could have been removed from the movie entirely, and it wouldn't have affected anything at all. But again, we're going into spoilers there, and then we have the third act where we have various reveals, big battles, some very tense emotional stuff, which I thought was handled very well, and set up everything for the next episode, I think, very handily, and I'm very excited to see where we go next. It ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger, but not so much that you're like, wait a minute, all this other stuff isn't resolved, but enough that you're like, okay, I want to see where we go next. So yeah, I enjoyed The Force Awakens, and I am a big Star Wars fan, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. I was born in 1977. I'm actually 3 months older than Star Wars. Jan is saying the best thing about this Star Wars movie is we will most likely never see a special edition of The Force Awakens. Probably, and that's a good thing. Honestly, I don't feel like you needed to add... Well, okay, I can't say you needed to add more to it. There were some things that I kind of wished had been explained a little bit better. Again, it didn't take me out of the movie, but there were certain things that I sort of had to speculate about in my head and sort of like explain away in my head rather than like having them just like take a scene to say, okay, this is why this is the way it is. But again, it's just like one or two scenes that just help explain the mostly having to do with the political landscape that we find ourselves in this movie. Without going into too much detail, like there's definitely a different power dynamic going on here, but for me it wasn't explained well or enough. But it's not that it took me away from it. I just would have liked to have seen that explained a little bit better. But again, it didn't have any super bearing on the plot. There was one now. Okay, one thing that a lot of people have been talking about in the Vegas terms is that this is almost beat for beat a rehash of the first movie, A New Hope. I don't entirely agree with that. Like, there are definitely story beats in there that mirror A New Hope. There are also story beats in there that mirror Empire Strikes Back. But never to the point where, at least for me, I felt like, oh god, this is all just a complete retread. And I think most of that has to do with the fact that these new characters were so likable, and I was invested in them, and I wanted to see their new adventures, and I wanted to see what was going on with them. So the fact that we were going over certain story beats that we have seen before didn't bother me as much. Had these new characters not worked, it probably would have bothered me a lot more. Um, but again, and Temple is asking, are we talking Star Wars with spoilers? I haven't seen it yet. No, we're not talking spoilers. I'm trying to keep it vague. Um, we're going to talk about Star Wars in a wider expanse in a little bit, but I wanted to get our discussion about The Force Awakens out of the way first. But again, I'm trying to keep it spoiler light, not talking about anything specific that wasn't directly shown to us in the movie's official publicity. Just because I figured there were probably people in the chat who haven't seen it yet. It's only been out for a couple days. um, and also, if you didn't get your tickets on pre-sale, odds are it'll be difficult for you to get good seats or to even find a theater that has open seats at this point this weekend. So, therefore, I feel like the statute of limitations on spoilers should be a little bit longer. But for a lot of people, those who have seen it, I think most people liked it. I've come across a few people who genuinely disliked it. Haravandi saying, my Ustream app is doing weird things in the video. It looks like Josh has had way too much coffee and is jittery. This is only my second cup. I swear to God, I haven't, I'm not crazy yet. So what was I talking about? Ava had mentioned something about the lightsaber fights in this movie and how they felt more real. And to that, I definitely agree. Like, one of the things that I felt was a real problem in the prequels, along with so many other things. But one of the things that really bugged me was the fact that the lightsaber fights felt so over choreographed. Like, it felt more like a dance. And also, one of the things that always bugs me in sword fighting, and this is probably because I actually had theatrical combat training, is when I see people sword fighting and they're actually swinging at the sword rather than the person holding the sword. It really takes me out of it. And you saw that a lot in the prequels. And also, they were just very over choreographed. It felt unreal. And in this, the lightsaber fights felt much more visceral, much more desperate. And it also felt like it would only take like just one quick second of either person just not concentrating fully for it to go in a completely bad direction. So they felt like real sword fights. They felt like real desperate sword battles. And also, a number of the people using lightsabers didn't really have a lot of experience with them. And so you saw a lot of like sort of stumbling around with it, which I thought was really cool. And Temple is saying, yeah, that's a little frustrating. What's the point of a sword fight if you're attacking the sword and not your opponent? And that's one of my big stunt choreography gripes, is because people choreograph the fights so much that when you have people swinging swords, they tend to forget that, like, yes, the swords need to connect, but it's dependent on your opponent going on the defense, whereas you on the offense have to be attacking your actual opponent. And there's a level of trust there. Like, you have to trust that when you swing at your opponent, that they are going to be there on the defense to block it in just the right way. So you have that, so that you have that impact, that meaningful impact. But I could go off on a rant about that, which I won't do. And so Ava's saying, I cried at the scene with the lightsaber that I can't talk about. Yes. And I know exactly which scene you're talking about. And no, we can't talk about it. I, for one, saw it coming. So it sort of lost a little impact with me. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't a well done scene. It's just that the fact that this was very much beat for beat a rehash of previous movies that we had seen. I kind of saw every plot point coming. Um, but again, the reason I was okay with that was because I enjoyed these new characters. And that's really, like, this movie was going to live or die on whether or not we bought into these characters. And we did. Or I did. I really liked them. And so I was invested in them, and I was okay with a lot of stuff that I probably would have been less forgiving of had those new characters not worked. Um, so so that's where I am with that. I think Oscar Isaac is I've really enjoyed him in a lot of different stuff. He played Poe Dameron in the movies, and he is the guy who I really feel deserves to be like the new like Harrison Ford leading man type guy who is just in so many things playing like the dashing lead because he was great. And I've liked him in Inside Llewyn Davis, Ex Machina. Those are the two big movies that I had seen him in before. Um, and he was phenomenal in this movie. Like he brought a good level of humor. That's the big thing in this is that there was a good sense of humor in this movie. It wasn't stoic the way the prequels were, and even to a certain extent the original trilogy. Um, a lot of the levity in the original trilogy came from Han and Chewie and from R2 and 3PO. Um, and in this you get levity, you get some nice character moments, you get some nice humorous moments. Um, but never so much that it's distracting from the plot, and all of their chemistry is just perfectly on point. Like um the friendship that the friendship and the bond that develops between Finn and Rey, uh I totally bought into it. And Jan is saying no stupid 10-minute Jedi Council scenes. Very true. Um, but again, I would have liked to have seen just like a little bit more of just like maybe one scene that is maybe like a minute, 2 minutes long that just helps give us a bit more of a grounding into what the political landscape of this new version of the Star Wars universe really is. And I Stole the One Ring is saying I loved him and the relationship between him and BB. Yeah, between Poe and BB. Yeah, I love that. Like, because they're separated through most of the movie, and when they finally meet up again, like it all, I was half expecting Poe to actually give BB a hug. Like it was that joyous a reunion. And BB-8 I thought was a really fun character. Now I've encountered a lot of my friends' cynicism with BB-8, saying, "Oh, he was just there to sell toys and to be some new thing that they put in the movie," and he's like just very cynically, basically dismissing BB-8 out of hand. And I'm like, yes, he was there to sell toys. There is absolutely no question about that. Yes, he was there to be a new thing. Of course he was. This is a new movie. You want new things. But he worked. He was a fun character. He was cutesy. He they managed to pack a lot of character into this thing which is essentially just a ball with a head on it. Um, they were able to give him emotion. They were able to give him a good bit of character, much in the same way they did with R2D2 back in the original trilogy. without BB-8 just like straight up replacing R2-D2. There are certain things with R2 in this that I won't go into because that goes into spoiler territory. So it almost felt like BB-8 was a replacement, but he still worked for me. Uh, and Temple is saying, heck yeah, he's there to sell toys. That doesn't mean he can't be a fun character too. And that's absolutely true. And I sort of feel like a lot of the cynicism comes from the prequels with Jar Jar Binks and how Jar Jar was there primarily to sell toys. And the problem with Jar Jar was that, yes, he was there as mostly a marketing ploy, and he was just not a fun character. He was awkward. He was stupid. He he was grating. He is annoying. And so the fact that you walk out of that movie and you're like, oh, I really dislike that Jar Jar character, and then you see him on toy shelves everywhere, it's just going to heighten this sense of, God, I really don't like this character. And so that's I think a lot of that is where that comes from. And so because that happened with Jar Jar, therefore everything that has some sort of marketing tie-in is therefore cynical and unnecessary. And that I don't totally agree with. Like, and Jan is saying, a friend of mine studying electrical engineering kept saying how BB-8's design doesn't make any sense in terms of physics and stuff, but it had so much personality. I loved it. And that's true. And I felt the same way. Like, BB-8 is not a practical droid. But then you know what? Neither was R2-D2. Because R2-D2 would have been stymied by stairs. That is until they retconned that he had jetpacks and could fly in the prequel trilogy. Which, by the way, he never uses in the original trilogy, so that felt weird. But yeah, I mean, R2-D2 is not... he doesn't make sense physically, but then, you know what? Neither did the AT-ATs, neither did the AT-STs. They, like... And the AT in those names actually stand for all-terrain, and both of those vehicles were like, they would not work on most terrains, let alone making them okay for all terrains. As is evidenced in both battle scenes and how easily they're taken out just by focusing on their legs. So yeah, from a practical standpoint, BB-8 is not a very practical design, but that's how it is in this universe, and that's part of the suspension of disbelief. And because BB-8 had so much personality, I was willing to let a lot of that go. And because the new characters, because Rey and Finn and Poe and BB-8 were all cool characters who I genuinely was invested in, a lot of stuff, I was able to suspend my disbelief with a lot of this movie. And that's what you do with Star Wars, is you suspend disbelief. We got a big message from somebody here. Let me just bring that back up. Temple is saying, it's kind of a difficult thing handling marketing ploys. The reality is movies that have tie-in toys will always be commercials for the toys or what have you. The movie industry is there to make money. Should we be cynical, or should we enjoy what we want to enjoy about it and pick... Or should we enjoy what we want to enjoy about it and pick and choose how we want to engage in the commercialism? And I totally agree with that, Temple. Like, yes, there is a merchandising aspect of Star Wars, and there's no getting around that. You can either be cynical about it and just straight up hate everything there is about it, or you can embrace the stuff that is actually fun. You can go to it with an open mind. Jan is saying, in JJ we trust, forget about money, JJ is our god. That I don't agree with. And that's only because, yes, while I enjoyed this movie, J.J. Abrams does not have a very strong track record with me. As I've discussed on other podcasts, maybe a little bit here too, I absolutely despise J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies. Um, I I absolutely loathe those movies. Um, and I will spare you all from the rant of why I really really dislike them. Um, and I didn't care too much for Super 8. Um, I thought it had a strong opening, fairly strong middle, but then fell apart at the end. Um, so I mean, I go in like sort of feeling like J.J. Abrams is not the strongest director. What he is, however, is he's the safe director. He's the one who's going to bring the fan service. He's the one who's going to bring the joy into this kind of movie because he himself is a fan. Um, and also he's uh, Neon is saying I would buy him a beer ASAP if I were to meet him. And you know what? As far as like what he did with Star Wars, you know what? I would too. Like, I give credit where it's due. And Star Wars, he did a very good job with. Now, this was the movie that I sort of feel was the safe movie. This was the movie that was designed to get Star Wars fans back on board with what they're going to be doing with Star Wars. This was so there's a lot of retreading. Um, there's a lot of repeating of story beats that we all know. We're bringing back the old characters again. We're bringing a fanboy in who will also take orders from the studio to direct it. This was the safe movie. This was the movie that they had to make in order to get fans back on board, so that they could then take Star Wars in a new direction with the later movies. Oh. And now they're talking about JJ and his lens flares, and you know, there are some in this movie. They're not all over the place and they're not distracting. Like when they show up, they feel kind of right in context. Um, so yeah, that's Ava's saying I like JJ and I really like the first Star Trek movie. Um, and that's okay. I personally I didn't like it. Um, I was not super angry with it. I just didn't like it. Um, then Into Darkness came out and I got angry because that was the movie that felt like a cynical attempt to try to play up fan service, and it didn't work for me. Star Wars, on the other hand, this one was definitely playing to the fans. It was playing to its audience, but it worked. This time it worked, and I was totally okay with it. Um, I was able to suspend my disbelief. I was able to suspend my cynicism and just go in and enjoy the ride, and it was an enjoyable ride. And I genuinely want to see where they go with this next because honestly, at this point, they've gone over the story beats from the original trilogy so much. They've gone over so many of them at this point that they have nowhere else to go in the next movies but somewhere new. And that's a very heartening idea to me. And Jan is saying JJ's Star Trek movies is the only Star Trek I've seen. Well, then I have a movie that I should recommend for you, Jan, and that is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. You don't need to see any other Star Trek to get into it, and it's a wonderful, wonderful movie. That's one that I would recommend for anybody. Uh, so yeah, I think that's all I have to say about Star Wars without or the Force Awakens without getting into spoilers. Because there's a lot of stuff in this that they did rightly keep secret. Um, and I don't want to talk about it. I would rather those of you who haven't seen it, you deserve to go in and see it without knowing ahead of time what is going to happen. There are certain people who would disagree with me about that and say like, well, if you wait 2 weeks, then you deserve to then if you wait 2 weeks to see Star Wars, then you don't deserve to have nothing spoiled for you. And I disagree with that. Like, everybody deserves their first and unsullied first look at something, regardless of when they actually get to it. There are some things in this world that the ending has been spoiled for us so much that it's part of popular culture. And Jan is saying it seems like Jurassic World and Star Wars 7 ended up taking pretty much the same approach and enjoy both movies very much. And I did too. And I found that like the same cynical people who didn't like Star Wars Force Awakens are the same people who didn't like Jurassic World, because it was so much of a retread. And okay, there were certain things in Jurassic World I didn't like either. But there that's how the I hate to say it, but that's how you get butts in seats. Is you people will gravitate towards the familiar. The problem I'm seeing right now is that in the marketing, you're showing the familiar, which is that's fine. That's how you get the butts in seats. But once you have them in there, you're still doing mostly the familiar, and you're only adding in little new things here and there, but never anything like really earth-shatteringly new or mind-blowingly new. Like, there was a moment in The Force Awakens, and I'm gonna be very vague about this, where the bad guys do something that I thought initially was something very big and very game-changing. And then it turned out to not be what I thought it was. And all I could think was, oh man, that was such a missed opportunity. Like, you could have really done something very powerful and very ballsy in Star Wars. But they ultimately didn't. Now, there's another thing that happens that you would say is also very ballsy, but it's also something that you'll probably see coming a mile away. Like, part of me is just thinking about, like, if the First Order, who are the bad guys in this, if they had done what I thought they had done, this would have really changed things, and it would have raised the stakes in this new trilogy in a very major way. And part of me thinks, like, maybe that was their original intention, and something happened and they backed out at the last second. But yeah, when we get to it, when you see it, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. And Jan is saying the director of Looper will direct the next episode. Yes, and that's why I'm looking forward to that. And I didn't realize that Colin Trevorrow was going to be doing episode 9. I'm totally okay with that. I thought he did a very good job with Jurassic World. And I'm definitely looking forward to the next episodes. I'm also looking forward to Rogue One, which is sort of like, I don't know what you would call it, because it's a prequel to this, and it's sort of a prequel to the original trilogy, but it's a sequel to the prequel. So is it like a midquel? What is it? I don't know, but I want to see it. But that's being directed by and I can't remember his name, the guy who did Godzilla this year, which I thought was another fantastic movie. And again, banking on the familiar, but doing it doing so in a very fun and engaging way, I thought. Same with Jurassic World and same with The Force Awakens. Um, but now that we have this out of the way, this movie that is genuinely fan service, but good fan service. Now that we have that out of the way, we can get into more original material and take this story in new directions. And I really want to see where we go with it, with the new characters and with the older characters, to see what their arcs are going to be from here on out. Um, so so yeah, that's that's the Force Awakens for me. Um, Now, one of the big controversial decisions with these new Star Wars movies, and when I say controversial, I mean one that uh, uh, when I say controversial, I mean a decision that made a number of fans angry, and that goes into the actual topic for this week, which is expanding the universe into book form. As many of you probably know, that there is a wide, expanded Star Wars universe in the form of books and comic books and video games, but mostly in books, primarily in book form. And Disney made the decision that all of those books that, for better or for worse, had generally been considered part of the Star Wars canon, they were now saying these books are now officially not part of the canon. Um, and that made fans that made a number of fans, mostly the ones who have been reading a lot of these books over the years, it made them understandably upset, because there are certain characters in these books that I know when it was first announced that they were going to be making new Star Wars movies, my first thought was, oh my god, there's this character in this book. Are we finally going to see that person on screen? Because that would be amazing. And then it turns out probably not. And now there's a little bit of a strangeness with Star Wars and its expanded universe. And this is something that I think most people kind of forget, is that for after Return of the Jedi came out, after Return of the Jedi came out, which was 1983, there was essentially no new Star Wars between 83 and I would say 1997, when they re-released the special editions. Hervani's saying, I don't care if the books are canon or not. I just want a Lego game version of the new movies. It doesn't take much to make me happy. Okay, the Star Wars Lego games are fun. Okay, but the thing I sort of feel like most people kind of forget is that for most of the 80s and a good part of the 90s, Star Wars, there was no new Star Wars. There was nothing Star Wars in the world other than the original trilogy. And it had taken on more of a cult status. Um, like, it was, Star Wars was sort of this thing that, like, a lot of people of our generation knew and liked, but it wasn't really part of popular culture. It was just something that, like, we had fond memories of. And it wasn't until because Lucasfilm had put the kibosh on anything Star Wars related coming out. There were not going to be any new movies. There were not going to be any TV shows. There weren't going to be any books. There weren't going to be comics. There wasn't going to be anything. Star Wars, for the most part, was over and done with. There was nothing new coming out. And so all we had was the original trilogy and our fondness of it. And so when you have that, it sort of develops more of a cult status than a popular culture status, because there's nothing new coming out. There's there's nothing for the fans to sort of gather around or rally behind. And and so it was a, and I'm gonna have to look this up. If you give me a second. Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna do it here. Pardon me 1 second. I'll be right back. Aha, I have a computer thingy. I have to look this up. Okay. So it wasn't until 1991 that Lucasfilm actually actually finally relented and said, "Okay, you can start writing new books in the Star Wars universe." And what we had was a new book trilogy that has it's gone on to be called the Thrawn trilogy. But the first book to come out was this one called Heir to the Empire. What's going on here? Okay. Yeah. Still figuring this thing out. Okay. So there was a book that came out called Heir to the Empire. That was the first part of a new trilogy, and this was a set. While it wasn't actually called Episode 7, a lot of people accepted this book as Episode 7, and this trilogy is 7, 8, and 9. And what it and it followed the adventures of Han, Luke, and Leia. Maybe like 5-10 years after Return of the Jedi, with them reconstructing the New Republic, and trying to fill up the power vacuum that had been set up by the Empire by destroying the Empire. With Leia in charge, and Leia had been getting some Jedi training from Luke, sort of learning how to use thought manipulation through the Force in order to help with diplomacy. And so you have Han, Luke, and Leia. Luke is trying to figure out a way to reignite the Jedi Order. And meanwhile, there is a splinter group that is still loyal to the Empire that is building momentum and trying to retake its place. And it's led by a character who I think a lot of people immediately got excited that he may show up on screen when they first announced that they were going to be making new Star Wars movies. And that is a character whose name is Grand Admiral Thrawn. Hence why this is called the Thrawn trilogy. And first of all, he's a really cool character, but he's a very well written character, but more than that, he is a cool looking character. Let me see if I can find a good image of him. Yeah, kinda. So, let's put this up here. That's kind of what he looks like. And he was the character that everybody was hoping we would see on screen. Now Temple is saying, my brother read all the Star Wars books. There was a female character he really liked, and I can't remember her name for the life of me. I believe you're probably thinking of Mara Jade, who was kind of like a rogue Jedi character who has this sort of on again, off again relationship with Luke. Um, Now, I haven't read all of the expanded universe books because, first of all, there are so many of them. Second of all, not all of them are that good. Um, uh, Harivandi saying he looks really blue. Is he getting enough oxygen? Yeah, that's sort of the thing about Thrawn is he's blue skin, red eyes, um, and he's a really he's a very cool, calculating, like very imperial type of character. Like he is probably one of the best successors to Darth Vader, just as far as intimidating bad guys go. Um, and so I personally would have really liked to have seen Thrawn on stage on screen. And who knows? Maybe at some point Disney will relent and say, "Okay, we're gonna bring Thrawn into this," because honestly, like, okay, one of my more major criticisms of the Force Awakens is that the bad guys in this are just not very intimidating. There's it's hard it was hard for me to really feel strong stakes with these guys just um because they were very, you see, I can't really talk about them too much without going into spoilers, but I considered them to be weak villains. And what they really needed was a Grand Admiral Thrawn, somebody who is just super confident, super intimidating, and somebody who is calculating, knows everything 50 steps ahead, and is ready to, and knows it, and you can't phase this guy. And Temple is saying it's kind of interesting. Last week we talked about adaptations from books into movies, and now we have a series of movies that were adapted into books. Yeah, that was kind of my intention there. um, and Ava's saying it's just the beginning of evil, and that's true. There's definitely like a start to this, as far as the villains go, but for my part, because the good guys, the protagonists, were so strong, I really wanted antagonists who were equally strong, and that requires somebody who is intimidating, somebody who, as soon as they're on screen, you know this guy means business, like the way Darth Vader was, and you don't have that in the Force Awakens. And I feel like you could have had that with Grand Admiral Thrawn, played by like somebody like Benedict Cumberbatch. um, um, I stole the One Ring saying it's not a Star Wars movie unless someone loses a hand. Well, I'm trying to think. Did anybody lose a hand in this one? I don't think they did. Um, there were certainly lightsaber impacts and people got injured by them, but I don't think any limbs were actually lost. I could be wrong. I'd have to watch it again. Um, uh, so um, so yeah, the expanded universe for Star Wars was very interesting because like I said, up until from 1983 to 1991, there was nothing Star Wars. There was no new Star Wars anywhere, and it had this more of like it had the status of something that was like a fond memory. And then when the new book started coming out, then suddenly the fans were energized and we were like, "Oh my god, we've got new Star Wars again. It's in book form, but we've got it." Um and I Stole the One Ring is saying Tolkien might have started it, but it's a common theme now. As far as, I guess you're talking about losing limbs. Tolkien didn't start the losing limbs thing. That goes way back to old mythology. Like that is a common trope. Um, so that I don't think there is any one writer or any one creator who can claim ownership over that trope. That's just something that's always sort of been there. Um, so um, so yeah, with these new books, it sort of opened the door for this whole new expanded Star Wars universe to take shape. And so we had the Thrawn trilogy, which was the first one. Then after that, um, there was the Jedi Academy trilogy, which focused on Luke trying to rebuild the Jedi Academy and rebuild the Jedi Order, and accidentally awakening an old Sith Lord in while doing so. Um, and then it starts going in all sorts of different directions. You've got stories that take place many years later. You've got stories that take place way, way in the past with the Tales of the Jedi and stories of like the old ancient Jedi back in the early days of the Republic. Um, you've got you've got stories that sort of take place in between the movies, in between episodes 4 and 5, episodes 5 and 6, because you have to remember that there are actually 3 years between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and there's a full year between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. So a lot of people started telling stories about what happened in those in between parts, and then there were stories in between the stuff that had happened in the expanded universe, and it became this very jumbled craziness, and it's still going on. And I mean, some of these books, the books that I read, which I admit are not many of them, I've liked. There have been others that I've heard were not good, and because there are so many different writers involved in it now and so many different ideas going on, it's kind of hard to maintain consistency, and maybe that's why Disney opted to just not get that stuff involved in the new movies. And if that's the reason, I totally understand it. Having said that, there are certain aspects of it that I kind of wish they had brought into or they would consider bringing into the new movies, just because I think they would really add some cool depth to it. Um, and Jan, we're still talking about losing limbs in fiction, and Jan is saying lots of damaged limbs in the extended edition chariot ride. I'm guessing from Battle of the Five Armies. There, I don't know if it was limbs so much as heads that go flying everywhere, because I swear to God, that thing was a decapitation machine. Um, and so that's Star Wars, and um, there are lots of other book expansions on lots of other things. Like there have been Star Trek novels for almost as long as there's been Star Trek. I've only read a few of them, and the ones that I've read were not that great. There are others that I'm sure are really good. I just haven't gotten them. There's Doctor Who, which I haven't yet dipped my toes into. Book wise, TV show, I'm all over that. Um, and I know Ava had mentioned that she reads the books that are based on the TV show Supernatural, which I'm a big fan of. But I haven't read the books of that, so I don't know if Ava, you want to say something in the chat about the Supernatural books, because there's an interesting thing in the TV show where they do this sort of meta storyline where there's a guy who is sort of getting divine inspiration, and he's telling the stories of the main characters in the show Supernatural in the form of books. Uh, and so in the show, the books are now an avatar for the show itself, and it's got a rabid fan base, and it's got people who are doing fan fiction on it. It's basically a way for the writers to sort of make comments about the Supernatural fan community, I think, but it's done in a very fun way. And so now there actually are books, which I haven't read, and I'm. I mean, Ava says she loves them, and so I trust her opinion. I would love to read them, or at least some of them. There's a lot to read. um, what is this? Pardon me while I go back in the chat a little bit here. Jan is saying, didn't Lucas start releasing console games with much more powerful Sith Lords as well that become part of the official story? Kinda, sorta. Temple is saying the Star Trek novels were never intended to be canon, though, compared to Star Wars, and that's true. The Star Trek books were always intended to be their own thing. That's why there's never any mention of them in the TV show, or there's no mention of stuff that happens in them in the TV show. However, and I never realized this until it was pointed out to me on CinemaSins. There was one book before Heir to the Empire that was released for Star Wars, and that was called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which came out maybe a year or two after A New Hope. That was supposed to sort of tell the story between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. I've never read it, so I don't know how good it is or how well it ties in, but apparently there is a mention of something from that book in The Empire Strikes Back, in the movie, which I had never realized before until it was pointed out to me. And that's when Han is leaving the Rebel base and he tells Leia that he has to go because they ran into a bounty hunter. Apparently that happens in that book, and that's what he's referring back to. And I did not realize that at all. Ava is saying the Supernatural books are basically supernatural episodes, and it always says at the beginning of the book what season it takes place in, so you know what's happening with the lore. Well, that's interesting. That's kind of a cool way of doing it. Because we're on season 11 of Supernatural now. There's a lot of stuff that's happened over the years, and so I like that those books sort of give you a little bit of a primer to tell you, okay, in the context of the greater show, this is where it's happening. So this sort of stuff has happened. All this other stuff has not happened yet. So that's kind of cool. So so we're at about an hour now, and I'd like to start to wrap this up a bit. We've talked mostly Star Wars, but then that's how it's going to be this weekend. Everything on the internet this weekend is Star Wars only, or mostly just Star Wars. Ultimately, I really liked The Force Awakens. I like these new characters. I want to see where it goes. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. If you can find any tickets, definitely go for it. If you can avoid spoilers, try to do so, just because it will help with your experience. Jan is saying here, really, I think the biggest crime here by far are the special editions of Star Wars. Go ahead, Lucas. Do all the changes you want. I'm happy to see them, but never take away the original movies. So much hard work forever lost, along with the brilliance of what changed the film history back then. I feel like the legacy of the original trilogy is kind of destroyed. Now, that's a very good point, Jan. The special editions of the trilogy, I don't mind George Lucas going back and tweaking things or changing things or re-releasing it. What I do mind is that we don't have the original versions to go back to rewatch if we want to. All we have are old VHS copies, if we were smart enough to still hang on to those, or Laserdiscs if we were still smart enough to hang on to those. But after that, after the special editions came out, you couldn't get the original versions anymore. Like, George Lucas was trying to say that they just don't exist, or they're not part of it anymore. And and so the original versions of the original trilogy, while they may not be what George Lucas had fully and originally intended, they still have a very strong place in our culture, and to wipe them out or to make them unavailable is very short-sighted. And now I've heard that Disney does plan on doing a Blu-ray release of the original despecialized unspecial versions of the original trilogy, and I hope that that's the case. I hope that they do that at some point, because I would love to. I would love to watch those movies again in the in good quality. So I hope that they do that. But yeah, like I said, changing it, I don't mind. If you're gonna do that, that's fine. But at least continue to give people access to the original version, which is the ones that it was their first experience. It's the one that is most closely associated with their memories, and it's the one that they like. It's something that they initially liked. It's something they will always like, and it hurts nobody by keeping that out there. Like, that way, fans have a choice. They can watch either the original or they can watch the special edition, however they want. So that's yeah, that's why I have a problem with the special editions. Not that they were made, but that the original versions were taken away. And Jan is saying, it just doesn't make any sense to appreciate the brilliance of the effects made in the 70s while having a CGI creature on screen at the same time. And yeah, this is all very true, what Jan and Temple are saying. The CGI didn't hold up well. The practical effects have held up much better. Totally agree there. So, yeah, here's hoping that we'll get the original trilogy back in our hands on Blu-ray, restored the way it should be, or I can't say the way it should be, the way we want it to be, the way we want to see it, the way that triggers that happy place in our memories. So yeah, that's I think we'll leave it there for this week. Go see Star Wars. Enjoy it. Don't be cynical about it. Just enjoy the ride. It's a fun ride, um and it's okay to suspend your disbelief and let go of cynicism and just enjoy a fun adventure, which I really feel this was. Our book of the month for December is A Christmas Story. We will be discussing this one next week, in context with the movie that it's based on. I'll also be doing something a little fun, a little different next week. After the episode is done, I'm gonna stay online and I'm gonna do a dramatic reading of the main story that A Christmas Story is based on, which is called Duel in the Snow, which is all about Ralphie trying to manipulate and get the BB gun that he wants for Christmas, which is the main plot line of A Christmas Story. It's going to be separate from the episode. It's going to be separate on the YouTube archive, because the reading is probably going to be about an hour long. So we're going to have a double episode next week to discuss A Christmas Story, to sort of wrap up our 2015, and then we'll end with a nice Christmassy dramatic reading, which I realize will be a couple days after Christmas, but so what? It'll still be fun. I had hoped to pre-record it, but I was sick for a lot of this month and my voice was not in tip-top shape. So instead of being able to pre-record it and edit it and do some fun stuff with it, instead I'm just going to do it live next week. So that'll be that. If it ends up being too late for you to stay up to watch it, that's okay. It'll be on YouTube, separate from the episode, so you can just plug it into your computer and just let it go. So yeah, that'll be it for this week. Thanks for everybody who showed up. And I will see you all next week for a Christmas story. Everybody have a wonderful Christmas if you celebrate it. If not, have a great extended weekend. And I will see you all next Sunday, and never stop reading.